Okay, now we're given a supply function and a demand function. P is selling price. Supply of S of P, our supply function, is negative 4,000 plus 200P for P greater than 20. And what this means is, if our selling price is P, our suppliers will produce this many. Okay, this is how many are going to be produced if the selling price is P. And our customers will purchase this many. And this is called the demand function. Okay, customers demand this many if our price is P. Now, let's think about what this means. First of all, the bigger P is, the more our suppliers are going to want to produce. Because, of course, they get more money if they produce more. Of course, then the bigger our price is, the less our demand is. Because the higher the price, the fewer people are going to want to buy it. So the demand function falls when P gets bigger. The supply function rises when P gets bigger. And the trick, the ideal situation is where we keep the supply and demand functions nearly equal. So we try to set a price where our supply and demand will kind of equalize. There are other things we want to think about, but that's one of the things that's sort of desirable. Okay, now, first of all, I say that P has to be greater than 20, because if P is less than 20, well, let's just answer one of the questions. Okay, what does the price have to be in order for supplier to produce anything? Clearly, if P is 0, the supply function would be negative 4,000. And you can't produce negative 4,000 of something. So that this function doesn't make any sense if P is 0. And if P is 10, well, 200 times 10 is 2,000 minus 4,000. We still have a negative number for our supply. We can't have a negative supply. It makes no sense to talk about the supply function if for values of P that make it negative. Can't have a negative supply. So what we have to do is we have to say, well, let's set this to be greater than 0 and see what P has to be. Well, if we set up an inequality with negative 4,000 plus 200P greater than 0 and solve for P, we find that P has to be greater than 20. And we can sort of verify that. If P is 20, then 200 times 20 is 4,000, and negative 4,000, that gives us 0. If P is greater than 20, then S of P is going to be greater than 0 because, of course, a bigger P gives us a bigger supply. Okay, and similarly, our demand can't be less than 0, and to get that, we take this expression on one side of an inequality and set it less than 0 and solve for P, and we get P is less than 800. Okay, as long as P is less than 800, we'll have a positive demand. And of course, we want 0 to be less than P because we're not going to set a negative price. So just common sense, the price has to be more than 0, has to be less than 800 though, in order to have any demand at all. So when we put these two together, we see that this combination works as long as P is greater than 20 and less than 800. Okay, now this has P greater than 0, but until P gets to 20, this doesn't make sense, so the whole model won't make sense until P is 20. So the model applies for P values between 20 and 800. Okay, so we're asked now to find the minimum price, and that's essentially the same thing I talked about up here, what prices make sense. The minimum possible price is the one for which your supply is greater than 0. So we, again, set the inequality. Here's the inequality I talked about. Set this greater than 0. Solve for P. It's very straightforward. You get P greater than 20. And maximum price. The maximum price is the price that drives the demand down to zero. You don't want a demand to be driven down. It can't be driven any lower than zero. So the demand has to be greater than zero. If we set the demand function greater than zero, and it looks like I left one of my zeros out of my 40,000, I'm going to slip it in there. Okay. If we set our demand function greater than zero and solve it, we get P less than 800. So that our price has to be greater than 20, less than 800. Okay. Now the question is, when does the supply equal the demand? Well, in class, people were very quick to say, well, you just set this equal to this. And I thought that was pretty good. Okay, so supply equal demand. Supply is negative 4,000 plus 200p. Demand is 40,000 minus 50p. And we solve this for P. And I think we get P equals 176. I didn't double check that. I left a question mark because you need something to do to keep yourself engaged here. Check out and make sure that that's the correct solution. I'm fairly sure that's right, but I wouldn't be completely surprised if you found that I was wrong there. Okay. Then question, when is the supply greater than the demand? Well, we set the supply function greater than the demand function, and we solve. And we're going to get, if this was an equality, we would, and equality, if this was an equal sign here, we would have this, and we get P equals 176. If this is greater than this, then we're going to follow the same steps. We're going to get a P on one side and 176 on the other. The question is P going to be greater than 176 or P less than 176? And we can answer that by common sense. What makes the supply function bigger? It's a bigger price. So the price will be bigger than 176. But I'm going to leave those as question marks here. And people in class said, well, okay, you rearrange the equation, you're going to have a positive multiple of P here, and you're going to have a positive number over here. So when you divide, you're going to have P greater than something. And that's also true in terms of the equation. So we can see that it's true in terms of the behavior of this function. We can see that it's true in the terms of this, I said equation, this inequality. This is an inequality, not an equation. Okay, then there's the graphical picture where we have our supply function and our demand function. Now to graph this picture, I started our supply function off at P equals 20, and then I had an upward slope meant to represent this, the slope of your supply function, which would be 200. Then for the demand function, I know that demand is going to be 0 and P is 800, so I know this point on the graph. So let's indicate that as the point I know on the graph. And let's also indicate this as the point I know on the graph of the S of P function. Okay, so it's got this point on the graph, and it's got, excuse me, a slope of negative 50. Okay, what's that mean? Well, in comparison with this slope, if this slope is 200, then negative 50 would be 1/4 of that slope, and of course would be decreasing. So our D of P function might well look something like this. The two graphs meet when D of P equals S of P, and that's going to occur when P equals 176, assuming I solved this correctly in the first place. Okay? So there's the picture that we can get from these inequalities and from analyzing this supply and demand situation.